the only white gorilla in the forest, and what the others did next. The forest had seen strange things before, but nothing like this. The rain had stopped an hour ago. Steam rose from the dark earth in thin, silent threads, curling between the roots of trees so old they no longer had names. Somewhere deep in the Dzanga basin, the kind of place where maps run out of detail and the undergrowth swallows sound whole, a female gorilla sat pressed against a fallen trunk and held something that shouldn't exist. The infant was white, not pale, not faded. White, like river mist, like the underside of a storm cloud. His skin caught the filtered green light of the canopy and threw it back. Wrong. Impossible. A small bright thing in a world built entirely from shadow and dark fur and the deep browns of ancient bark. His mother didn't move for a long time. She turned him slowly, her hands enormous and careful, the way hands are when they already understand that something fragile has entered the world. She pressed her nose to the top of his head and breathed. Whatever she was looking for, scent, warmth, life, she found it. Her arms closed around him. The group noticed before nightfall. It started with the juveniles. They came close, retreated, came close again. One reached out a hand and then pulled it back as if touching him might transfer something. The females watched from a distance, their expressions unreadable in the way that animal expressions always are, ambiguous, unsettling to anyone looking for reassurance. Two of them turned away entirely, which is its own kind of answer. The silverback came last. His name, if he had one, was written in the deference of every other body in the clearing. Massive, gray-backed and black-armed, with the kind of weight that doesn't need to announce itself. He walked to within 4 feet of the mother and stopped. He looked at the infant for a long time. The infant looked back, pale eyes catching the last light, too bright, too visible, entirely unaware of what his own existence was costing the air around him. The silverback made no sound. He turned and moved away. That silence was the first verdict. In the weeks that followed, the infant grew. He nursed. He clung to his mother's chest during movement, his white hands gripping dark fur, his face pressed sideways against her ribs. He learned the smell of the group before he learned anything else, the sharp musk of the adult males, the warmer scent of the females, the forest floor's particular mixture of rot and rain and something green and alive underneath it all. He also learned, without language, without the ability to name it, that certain silences were warnings. When he reached toward another juvenile, the juvenile moved away. Not aggressively, just away. The small, precise withdrawal that means not you. He tried again with a different one. Same result. He didn't understand it yet. He would. His mother held him tighter those nights. The canopy above them was impenetrable. No stars. Just the deep black of the forest breathing. And somewhere below it, a white shape that the darkness couldn't quite swallow. Too bright for this world, or at least for this version of it. The forest doesn't ask whether you belong. It only asks whether you can survive. And for him, those were never going to be the same question. He was 3 years old the first time one of them hit him. Not a full strike. A shove, really. The kind that carries a message more than force. One of the young males, barely older than him, caught him in the open during a feeding and drove a shoulder into his ribs hard enough to send him sideways into the brush. The others watched. Nobody intervened. His mother was 30 feet away and took one step forward before something, instinct, fear, the weight of the silverback's gaze, stopped her. The white gorilla got up. He didn't make a sound. That was the part nobody expected. He had learned, somewhere in those first years of small withdrawals and turned backs and food taken before he could reach it, that sound drew attention, and attention was rarely in his favor. So he absorbed the shove and he stood and he moved to the edge of the clearing and waited. Patient in the way that only animals raised on the outside of something can be patient. Not calm, exactly. Just practiced. The feeding continued without him. He ate last. He always ate last. By the time the others had moved through the fruit, the leaves, the larvae packed into the soft wood of a half-rotted trunk, there was never much left. He supplemented in secret, learning which plants the others overlooked, which bark held moisture, which insects gathered after dark in places the rest of the group never thought to check. He was hungry more often than not, but he was never as weak as they assumed. That distinction would matter later. It didn't matter yet. The shoves became a pattern. The young males, 3 of them, close in age, the kind of coalition that forms naturally in primate groups when status is still being established, seemed to find particular satisfaction in targeting him during transitions. When the group moved, When they settled to rest, when the silverback's attention was directed elsewhere, the timing was never accidental. Animals understand opportunity the same way humans do. His mother groomed him every evening. Long, deliberate sessions where she moved through his white fur with a focus that looked almost like apology. He leaned into it. Whatever else the day had taken from him, this remained. Her warmth, her certainty, the way she positioned her body between him and the rest of the group. When the light dropped and the forest went quiet, and the night felt like it was pressing in from every direction at once, he was visible in a way that none of them were. In the deep green shadows of the Dzanga, every other member of the group disappeared when they were still. Bark brown, shadow black, shaped by 10,000 years of selection to vanish against the forest floor. Him? He glowed. Dappled light found him through the canopy and announced him. He could not hide. He had never been able to hide. The hunters arrived in the dry season. They came from the north, following a trail that cut through the territorial edge of the group's range. The silverback smelled them before anyone saw them. That particular combination of metal and smoke and something chemical that didn't belong in any version of this forest. He gave the warning call, and the group compressed, moving tight and fast through the undergrowth toward the interior. The white gorilla moved with them, but he was visible from 200 meters, maybe more. The silverback stopped once and looked back at him. That long, flat assessment that contained everything and said nothing. The group was moving. The hunters were close. And here, at the back of the formation, was a white shape that could be tracked from a distance, that could be followed, that turned every instinct for concealment into a liability. The decision, when it came, didn't announce itself as a decision. That's how the worst ones work. During a river crossing 2 days later, chaotic, fast-moving water, everyone focused on footing and current. He fell behind. When he reached the opposite bank, the group had already moved into the tree line. He called once, low and urgent. No answer. He pushed into the brush and found their trail. He followed it for 20 minutes before the 3 young males appeared from the shadows ahead of him, spread wide, blocking the path. He understood then. He turned anyway, tried to go around. The largest one hit him from the side with full weight. Not a shove this time. A strike. He went down hard against exposed root and rock and came up bleeding from the shoulder. The second one drove him back toward the riverbank. The third circled. He fought. Briefly. Badly. Against odds that were never in his favor. When it was over, he was alone on the wrong side of the river, one arm hanging at a wrong angle, listening to the forest close back over the place where his group had been. The water moved past him, indifferent. Somewhere on the other side of it, the sound of the group faded until there was nothing left but the forest and the particular silence of a thing that has already happened and cannot be undone. He should have died in the first week. The shoulder healed wrong. Not broken, it turned out. He had been lucky in that specific narrow way that doesn't feel like luck when you're alone in the Dzanga basin, with no group, no protection, and a body that still moved like a juvenile even though the forest was treating him like something that needed to be eliminated. He couldn't climb properly for 12 days. He slept on the ground, pressed into the hollow base of a fig tree wide enough to swallow him, breathing shallow and listening to everything. The nights were the worst part. Not because of what came. Though things came, leopard scent drifting through twice in the first week, something large moving through the undergrowth on the third night that never showed itself, and never fully left. The nights were the worst because of the silence where the group used to be, the absence of other breathing, the particular weight of being the only warm thing in a cold, dark space. He ate badly and slept in pieces, and by the end of the second week he was thinner than he had ever been. Then something shifted. It didn't happen dramatically. There was no moment of decision, no visible turning point. It happened the way adaptation always happens in animals that survive. Incrementally, invisibly, one small adjustment compounding on another, until the creature that emerges barely resembles the one that started. He began moving at dawn and dusk instead of midday, when the light came hard through the canopy and turned him into something visible from every direction. The low light was softer, the shadows longer. He disappeared better at the edges of the day than he ever had in the middle of it. He found the rocky escarpment by accident, following a dry stream bed southeast for reasons that had more to do with instinct than plan. The terrain there was broken and vertical, basalt shelves stacked at odd angles, deep fissures, overhangs that created natural shelter without requiring him to climb. It was not the kind of landscape a guerrilla group would choose. Too exposed on the approaches, too loud with wind, not enough continuous canopy. But for a single animal that needed concealment more than comfort, it offered something the forest floor never had. He could see in every direction. He spent 3 weeks in the escarpment. He learned its specific logic, which rocks held heat through the night, which fissures collected rainwater, where the figs grew at the base of the formation, and which mornings the birds came in numbers large enough to mean fruit was ripe somewhere close. He was still hungry, but he was no longer starving, and he was no longer being hit. The stillness changed him in ways that wouldn't be visible for years. Without the constant management of group dynamics, the deference, the avoidance, the perpetual low-grade vigilance of being the one that others practiced dominance on, he had nothing to spend his energy on except the immediate problems of survival. Where is food? Where is water? Where is danger coming from? He solved these problems slowly at first, then faster, then with a kind of efficiency that looked from the outside like intelligence, though it was really just the result of necessity applied over time. His body changed too. He had always been large for his age. Another thing the young males had resented, the threat implicit in a body that was growing toward something significant. Now, without competition for food, eating exactly what he needed and nothing less, the growth that had been stunted by chronic stress began to accelerate. His shoulders widened. The silver was coming in earlier than it should have, stress-driven at first, then structural. The long guard hairs of his back catching light and holding it, so that in certain conditions, at certain angles, he looked less white and more like something that had been forged from the forest itself and then forgotten to be dark. He was not yet 3 years from the expulsion when he first encountered another guerrilla group. He smelled them before he heard them, and heard them before he saw them, the familiar compound of musk and vegetation and proximity that his body recognized before his mind could process it. He stopped at the edge of a clearing and watched from behind a screen of undergrowth. A family group smaller than his original one, a silverback, 4 females, juveniles, normal, intact, moving through the clearing with the particular ease of animals that have never been driven out of anything. He watched for a long time. He didn't approach. The silverback had already scented something. He could see it in the shift of posture, the raised head, the sudden attention directed toward the tree line where the white gorilla stood invisible in the shadow. The silverback made a low sound, gathering the group without urgency, and they moved away into the forest. He let them go. He stood at the edge of the clearing long after they had gone, in the quiet they left behind, and something passed through him that wasn't grief exactly and wasn't longing exactly, but occupied the same space those things would have occupied in a creature built to name its own feelings. Then he turned and went back to the escarpment. The forest had not become easier. He had become harder. Those are not the same thing, but in the places where survival is the only metric, the difference stops mattering. What no one in his original group could have known, what the silverback with his flat assessing stare and his practical cruelties could not have calculated, was that every year alone was building something, not anger, not vengeance, something quieter and more durable than either of those. He was learning the forest the way you only learn it when it's trying to kill you, and the forest, for all its indifference, was an excellent teacher. The old silverback's name, if the forest had given him one, would have been something like permanence. He had led the group for 11 years. 11 years of territorial disputes settled without escalation, of migration routes memorized and passed through the bodies of every animal that followed him, of predator threats absorbed and deflected through the specific authority of a presence that never needed to raise its voice because it had never needed to. He was not a gentle leader. Gentleness was not the point. He was a certain one. And in the deep grammar of primate society, certainty is the closest thing to safety that exists. But 11 years is a long time to carry weight. It showed first in the small things, the way he rose slower in the mornings, the stiffness in the left hip that the females noticed before he acknowledged it, the half-second delay before his responses that would have been invisible to anything less attuned than the animals that depended on him. The group noticed without understanding what they were noticing. They only knew that something in the air around him had changed, that the certainty, while still present, had begun to carry an edge of effort that it never used to. The young male had been watching for 2 years. His name in the group's hierarchy was pure position. Third-ranking male, 9 years old, built like something that had been compressed under pressure and then released all at once. He was not the largest. He was the most relentless. He had the particular quality that makes certain animals dangerous not in single confrontations but across time, the willingness to keep returning, to absorb costs that would stop a more rational creature, to treat each failed challenge not as a defeat, but as data. He started with displacement. Small, chronic, deniable, taking a resting spot, moving through the old silverback's space without the deference the space required, feeding slightly before the proper order. Each individual act was containable. The pattern was not. The old silverback responded each time. A look, a posture shift, once a short charge that ended without contact. But response without resolution is its own kind of erosion. The group felt it. The females began repositioning themselves subtly during rest periods, the unconscious recalculation of animals updating their assessment of where safety actually lived. The direct challenge came on a Tuesday, though the forest doesn't keep days. It came at mid-morning, in a clearing the group used as a regular waypoint during their eastern circuit. The young male approached from downslope, slow and deliberate, his path a straight line through the center of the clearing rather than the curved, deferential arc that subordinates used. The old silverback rose. The group went still, that specific stillness that is not calm but its opposite, every animal present holding itself in suspension, waiting. What followed lasted 4 minutes. It was loud, and it was brutal, and at the end of it the old silverback was still standing, but only just, and the distance between still standing and no longer leading had collapsed to almost nothing. The young male retreated, but he retreated slowly, and he retreated without the submission that would have closed the question. He sat at the edge of the clearing and breathed and looked back, and what was in that look was not defeat. It was a timeline. The group fractured along invisible lines in the days that followed. Not dramatically. There were no defections, no visible realignments, but the females moved differently. The juveniles, who calibrate everything against the behavior of adults, became louder and less disciplined in ways that would have been corrected immediately under the old order. The eastern migration route, which the silverback had maintained with precise seasonal timing for a decade, was delayed, then altered, then abandoned mid-circuit when the young male's challenge to the route's direction went unanswered. They were adrift without knowing the word for it. The hunters came back during this period, not the same ones from years ago, or maybe they were, the forest doesn't distinguish, but the signs were identical. Metal smell carried on the northern wind, a silence in the bird population that preceded human movement, the way a shadow precedes its object. Snare wire found at the edge of the territorial boundary, crude but effective, the kind of trap that doesn't require precision, because it simply waits. Under the old order, the response would have been immediate. Southern withdrawal, tight formation, specific avoidance routes built from years of pattern recognition. The old silverback knew where the humans came from and where they didn't, knew which corridors were clean and which weren't, had written this knowledge into the group's movement the way a river writes itself into stone. But the old silverback was no longer fully in command, and the young male didn't know what he didn't know. The group moved north, directly toward the snare line. The old silverback made the sound, low, insistent, directional, that meant wrong way. The young male ignored it, or didn't recognize its specific urgency, which amounted to the same thing. 3 females followed the young male. 2 stayed behind with the old silverback. The juveniles split, which is the worst possible outcome in any threat scenario, because juveniles have no independent survival calculus. They follow whoever moves with the most confidence, and confidence had changed addresses. By nightfall, the group was fragmented across a 2-kilometer stretch of forest, straddling a snare line, leaderless in the specific way that only happens when leadership exists, but has become contested rather than resolved. The old silverback sat at the base of a strangler fig and breathed. 11 years. He had moved this group through floods and disease and territorial incursions and the particular grinding pressure of humans who never fully left. He had done it through the accumulated authority of 1,000 correct decisions made in sequence, each one building on the last, until the whole structure was so dense and interlocking that it seemed like it would hold forever. It doesn't hold forever. Nothing does. He sat in the dark and listened to his group scattered across the forest and made the low contact call, over and over, patient and diminished, trying to pull the pieces back toward the center, before morning came and the hunters began to move. Some of them answered, not all. He smelled them before he reached the river. Not the hunters, the group. 7 years of solitude had sharpened something in him that most gorillas never develop because they never need to, a kind of environmental reading that went beyond scent and sound into something closer to pattern recognition. the ability to feel the shape of a situation from its edges before the center became visible. He had learned it from the escarpment, from the rocky terrain that forced long sight lines, from years of being the only animal responsible for his own survival. He knew when something in the forest's normal rhythm had been interrupted. He had known it for 2 days before he crossed the river. The group was in trouble. He moved carefully, not slowly, carefully, which is a different thing. His body had become something that the forest didn't quite know how to categorize anymore. He was enormous, larger than the silverback who had expelled him, carrying the kind of mass that accumulates in an animal that has spent years doing hard physical work without the metabolic drain of chronic social stress. The white fur had deepened as it silvered so that in low light, he read as something ancient and elemental, the kind of presence that older primates in the region responded to with a deference they couldn't explain. He found the first snare at the edge of the northern corridor. Wire, partially sprung, with evidence that something small had triggered it and escaped. He stopped and read the ground around it. 3 sets of human footprints, recent, moving east along the snare line. Bird silence in a band approximately 40 meters wide running parallel to the line. And beyond it, pressed into the soft earth at the base of a water-bearing palm, the unmistakable impression of a guerrilla group that had moved through this area recently, moving north, moving directly toward the line. He turned north. He found them scattered across 2 kilometers of forest, fragmented in a way that made something tighten in his chest that wasn't quite memory and wasn't quite grief, but carried the weight of both. The old silverback was at the southern edge, sitting apart, diminished in the specific way that animals diminish when authority has been taken from them. Not smaller physically, but compressed somehow, as if the space he occupied had contracted around him. 2 females nearby, juveniles in the trees above, uncertain. The young male was 400 meters north, closer to the snare line, with 3 females, and the group's 2 oldest juveniles clustered behind him. He was doing what unstable leaders do, moving forward because forward felt like authority, without the knowledge base to understand what forward meant in this specific terrain. The white gorilla came out of the forest from the west. He didn't announce himself. He simply appeared at the edge of the clearing where the young male had stopped and stood, and the light came through the canopy in the particular way it came through in the early morning, and for a moment, the young male just stared. He had never seen anything like this, none of them had. The young male's response was predictable, a threat display, percussive chest beats, a short charge designed to establish dominance before the situation could be assessed more carefully. It was the right move against a normal challenger, against something that had been alone in this forest for 7 years, that had survived leopards and hunger and the kind of isolation that either kills an animal or builds it into something outside the normal categories. The charge was simply information. The white gorilla didn't move, not a step back, not a posture shift. He absorbed the charge the way the escarpment absorbed weather, without adjustment, without concession, as if the force exerted against him was simply irrelevant to what he was. The young male stopped 6 feet away. What passed between them in the next 30 seconds was not a fight. It was a renegotiation of physics. The young male was large and strong and genuinely dangerous. The white gorilla was larger, stronger, and had the specific quality that cannot be manufactured or performed, the absolute absence of doubt. He had been alone too long for doubt. He had resolved every question about his own survival through direct encounter with the consequences of being wrong. What stood in that clearing was not aggression. It was the distilled result of 7 years of the forest's hardest curriculum. The young male broke first, not dramatically. He simply looked away, that specific lateral eye movement that means I am removing my claim, and the geometry of the clearing rearranged itself instantly, every animal present updating their internal map of where authority lived. Then the white gorilla turned toward the snare line. He moved along it from west to east, deliberate and unhurried, reading its configuration the way he had learned to read terrain. As a text, a set of decisions made by something with intentions, a structure with a logic that could be understood and therefore navigated. He had encountered human infrastructure before, alone, in the years of learning. He knew what wire meant. He knew what the silence of birds along a specific corridor meant. He moved the group south with a series of vocalizations that were not commands exactly, but were structured with enough specificity that the animals around him responded as if they were. The females moved first, then the juveniles, dropping from the trees. The young male followed, which was the most important thing, not because his cooperation was required, but because it completed the transfer, made it visible to every animal present that the structure had changed, and the change was total. He passed the old silverback last. He stopped. He stood close, closer than the old silverback would have allowed from any other animal, and for a moment, neither of them moved. 7 years compressed into that pause. The expulsion, the river crossing, the escarpment, the long education of solitude. The old silverback looked at him, that same flat assessment, the same dark eyes, and something in it was different now. Not apology. Gorillas don't do apology. Something more structural than that. Recognition. The white gorilla moved south. The group followed him into the forest, away from the snare line, away from the hunters moving east along the northern corridor, through terrain he knew better than any of them because he had learned it the hard way, which is the only way the forest teaches anything that actually holds. Behind them, the clearing was empty. The snare wire caught the morning light and held it, waiting for something that wasn't coming. The forest didn't hold a ceremony. There was no moment of formal installation, no ritual the group performed to mark what had changed. Leadership in the wild doesn't work that way. It works the way water works. It finds the lowest point and fills it, and once it has filled it, the shape of the container becomes the shape of the water, and after enough time passes you can no longer tell which one came first. He led because he moved, and they followed. That was all. That was everything. The first weeks were an adjustment for all of them. The group had been running on fractured authority for long enough that certain habits had calcified. The juveniles too loud, the females spacing during movement too loose, the feeding discipline eroded by months of inconsistent enforcement. He didn't correct these things through force. He corrected them through consistency, which is slower and less visible, but doesn't leave damage behind. He moved at the right times. He stopped at the right places. He made the contact calls at the intervals that kept the group's spatial awareness intact. He did the same things, correctly, until the group's behavior reorganized itself around the new center of gravity. The young male was the most complicated piece. He was still there, had nowhere to go, no independent survival skills sufficient for solitude, no external group that would absorb a challenger without a long and costly integration process. The white gorilla didn't drive him out. He simply made his position structurally redundant. Every time the young male's energy built toward challenge, there was nothing for it to attach to, because the white gorilla gave it nothing to push against. Dominance maintained through constant confrontation is exhausting and unstable. Dominance that simply exists, that doesn't require performance, has no surface for ambition to grip. The young male spent 3 weeks in a state of low-grade agitation, testing edges that didn't respond, and then gradually, the agitation settled into something that looked, from the outside, like acceptance. It wasn't acceptance exactly. It was the pragmatic recalibration of an animal that had updated its model of the situation. Close enough. The old silverback moved to the group's periphery, which is where aging males go when the weight has been transferred. Not expelled, not excluded, but gently eccentric, orbiting the group at a slight remove, present but no longer load-bearing. The white gorilla allowed this without comment, more than allowed it. During the first territorial circuit, when the old silverback's route instinctively diverged toward the eastern migration path he had maintained for a decade, the white gorilla followed it. Not because the path was optimal, because the knowledge encoded in it was real, accumulated through years of correct decisions, and discarding it would have been waste. He had spent 7 years learning. He understood the value of what a long life in this forest could teach. The snare line was dismantled, not by him, but the hunters who had set it moved on after 2 weeks without return on their investment, and the wire rusted into the undergrowth and eventually disappeared into the forest floor the way everything eventually disappears into the forest floor. The northern corridor reopened. He incorporated it back into the group circuit with modifications, keeping a 200-meter buffer from the old line's position, threading the route through the rocky terrain he knew from the escarpment years, where visibility was long and ambush was difficult. The group moved better than it had in years, not happier. Happiness is the wrong frame for animals whose entire existence is structured around the immediate management of survival, but more coherent, more like a single organism, and less like a collection of individuals making separate calculations. The juveniles grew, the females settled into patterns. The forest, which had been a place of danger and fragmentation, became again what it was supposed to be. A place of difficulty that was at least navigable, at least legible, at least something you could learn to move through if you had a center that held. He was that center. But here is the thing that no one in the group could have articulated, and that the forest registered only in the way the forest registers everything, silently, without judgment, in the patient accumulation of what happens over time. He governed differently because he had been governed badly. He protected the smallest juveniles not from sentimentality but from knowledge, the specific, embodied knowledge of what it costs to grow up as the one that others practice cruelty on. He maintained the feeding order but enforced the margins loosely, so that the animals at the bottom of the hierarchy ate enough. He positioned himself, during rest periods, at the edge of the group rather than the center, the position of maximum exposure, maximum vigilance, the place where the first sign of danger would arrive. The center was safer. He didn't take it. These were not moral decisions. He was not a philosopher. He was an animal that had learned certain things through the specific education of suffering and solitude and long survival, and those things had become structural, encoded in his behavior the way the migration routes were encoded, the way the snare line avoidance was encoded. He did what he did because he had been built by experience into something that did it. The forest didn't care about the distinction. Seasons turned. The rains came and went. The group grew by 3. 2 births, 1 juvenile from a dispersing female who found them on the eastern circuit, and integrated over the course of 2 careful months. The white gorilla's fur deepened further toward silver, so that in the full midday light, standing at the edge of the escarpment he occasionally returned to alone, he looked less like an aberration and more like something the forest had always been moving toward without knowing it. The difference that had nearly killed him had become the thing that defined him, not because the forest changed its mind about difference. The forest doesn't change its mind. It has no mind to change. But the group that had expelled a white infant on the banks of a rain-swollen river was now following a white silverback through terrain that would have destroyed them without him, and the distance between those 2 facts was the only story that mattered. He stood at the escarpment one evening in the dry season, the valley spread below him, the canopy moving in the low wind, the group settled behind him in the shadows of the rock. He had not chosen this. He had survived into it. There is a difference. Whether it matters, whether surviving into something counts as the same thing as choosing it, whether the forest's indifference to our suffering means the suffering had no meaning, or whether meaning is something we construct in the space between what happened and what we do next. That question the forest leaves open. It always leaves it open. What do you think? Can the thing that was meant to destroy us become the very thing that makes us who we are?